memory scenes to the stories that last forever, love letters to history we remember eternally.
Before women could vote, before they could run for office, before they could even legally control their own money, some of them already influencing the White House.
That's correct. Hostesses, political advisors, social diplomats, and occasionally the people quietly steering the ship while their husbands were supposed to be the captain.
It reminds me of that line from My Big Fat Greek Wedding. The man is the head, but the woman is the neck, and she can turn that head any way she wants.
Wise words, I would say. Today we're traveling from the very First Lady in 1789 all the way to the moment American women finally won the right to vote in the 1900s. Pour a drink and pull up a chair because the women of the early White House deserve a toast.
Welcome to Love Letters to History, where two besties dig into the women, the drama, and the stories that shape the America we live in today.
And I'm Liz, here for the facts, the personalities, and the moments where history gets a little messy.
I'm Emily, here for the history and the gossip of it all. Today we're starting our First Lady series, which means we're covering over a century of First Ladies, some famous and some forgotten.
And our drink today is called Temperance Punch, full of sugar and spirit. This is all a hilarious contradiction because the temperance movement literally sought to outlaw alcohol.
So mix some lemon or other citrus juice, honey syrup, mint, berries, and some sprinkling water or champagne. I vote champagne. But today we've added bourbon because rebellion feels appropriate.
Indeed, refreshing, patriotic, and close to illegal in 1919.
Our story starts with a woman who basically invented the job.
Yes, Martha Dandridge was born in Virginia and was widowed prior to marrying George Washington. She actually had four children from this first union, two of which passed away very young. So by the age of 26, she had already experienced great loss.
But Martha wasn't your average 18th century woman. While women were often taught basic reading and writing, Martha, aka Dear Patsy to George, was well educated for her time and managed large estates and finances before becoming First Lady.
I would say that's quite the resume. And she was a little bitty thing at only about 5 feet tall, paired with over 6 foot George. But as they say, size doesn't matter.
Sips for that. She was strong willed and very lively, which surely helped reel George in. Martha Washington never asked to be a public figure. She once said being First Lady made her feel like a state prisoner because there was a certain way she was expected to behave as First Lady.
But in spite of that, Martha created the model of a first lady, hosting political receptions, shaping the tone of the presidency, and establishing the idea that the president's spouse represented the nation socially. I love that she had a weekly reception to speak with locals and elites where they could talk and mingle. She made the presidency accessible.
Elizabeth, imagine people just being able to chill with the president on a random Wednesday. After George left office, the Washingtons retired to Mount Vernon, and George passed away just a couple of years after his time in office. Martha was George's champion when Congress wanted to move his body to the Capitol. She knew that George wished to remain at the family crypt. Martha passed a few years after, and they are laid next to each other at Mount Vernon.
I got the chance to visit DC and Mount Vernon as a teenager, and I would love to get back now as an adult. It's a trip I highly recommend. I remember seeing the graves. And also, FYI, don't visit Washington, D.C. in the summer because it's hot.
And that's coming from a Southerner.
Yes. Another special thing about Martha is that she is one of three first ladies to have a military ship named after her, a naval vessel, Lady Washington, that was used in the Revolutionary War. A true to size replica sits in Grays Harbor in Washington state.
Then comes the second FLOTUS, Abigail Adams, who might be the most intellectually influential early First Lady. Unlike Martha and George, the Adams marriage was the first and only for both of them. The loser in the early presidential elections became the vice president. So Abigail was both first second lady and the second first lady, in addition to being the mother president as well.
Now try saying that 5 times faster.
First second lady and the second first lady. First second lady and the second first lady.
You managed 2 times.
Yeah.
Good job. Abigail was very involved with her husband John Adams' politics, especially in her written correspondences. You can find digitized copies of these letters at masshist.org if you ever need something to do. They exchanged over 1,100 letters throughout their relationship. She famously told her husband John Adams to quote unquote remember the ladies when advocating for women's rights.
Spoiler, the founding fathers did not. But that's no surprise, right? Abigail's letters show she was advising the president constantly. So, the first ladies were influential behind the scenes in spite of the men being officially in charge.
Abigail was the first lady to live in the White House, formerly called the Executive Mansion. She passed away first in 1818, then John followed in 1826. They're buried together at a site in United First Parish Church, aka Church of the Presidents in Quincy, Massachusetts. Tourists can visit this site on a guided excursion.
Now, the third president situation was unique, with an acting first lady instead of what we might think of as a true first lady, because Thomas Jefferson was a widower. His daughter, Martha Jefferson Randolph, aka Patsy, acted as hostess both at their house in Monticello in Virginia and the White House for 2 winter seasons. She had 12 children, and
Wow.
her son James was the first non enslaved child born in the White House.
And Patsy managed to navigate through a huge scandal. Her father had a long term sexual relationship with a slave named Sally Hemings, who was actually Thomas's wife's half sister through their shared father, John Wales. This relationship issued several children and was somewhat hypocritical with Jefferson's arguments for liberty when he owned slaves. Martha is buried at the Jefferson family home, Monticello, next to her parents and her husband.
Next comes the first lady who loved the spotlight, Dolly Madison. Like Martha Washington, she was widowed prior to marrying her husband turned president. Both her first husband and the youngest son died due to yellow fever, but entered James Madison, and she found love again. Dolly was even excommunicated from her church because that James Madison was not a Quaker, but it didn't phase her.
Dolly was the political hostess extraordinaire as she served a primary role in helping our fledgling country establish its manners and style. She had the public rooms of the White House refurnished with socializing in mind. The Madisons' Wednesday evening receptions were so popular, they were referred to as squeezes because so many attended.
Claustrophobia. Her parties helped bridge political divides. Fun fact, Dolly hosted ice cream socials, which is cool because it was a delicacy at the time. But her favorite flavor? Oyster. Now, take a sip to get that taste out of your mouth.
Indeed. And Dolly famously directed servants to rescue the portrait of George Washington by taking the canvas out of the frame, as well as some important documents before the British burned the White House in 1814. Honestly, it's one of the most cinematic moments in early American history. Can you imagine the servants urging Mrs. Madison to leave as the British are coming? And she says, "But first, we must save George."
That's truly an award winning moment. She still remained popular until her death, receiving a crowd of visitors in her home on New Year's every year.
13 years after her husband died, Dolly finally passed, and she is buried with her family at Montpelier in Virginia, which was her and James's home.
After Dolly Madison, we get a series of first ladies who helped stabilize the young republic.
Yes, if you're someone who appreciates holding your cards close, then you might appreciate Elizabeth Monroe. She was reserved, elegant, and seemingly secretive. She was criticized for being a stark contrast to her predecessor, Dolly Madison, but ill health could have been a reason for this. However, her husband, President James Monroe, stated that it would have been impossible to find another woman better suited to be a political wife and a parent, with more attention, delicacy, and propriety than she has done.
President Monroe was a Virginia senator appointed as U.S. Minister to France in 1794 and U.S. Minister to the United Kingdom in 1803. Afterwards, he became President Madison's Secretary of State and then President himself.
Because of her European experience, Elizabeth decorated the White House to reflect the foreign courts. There is still a set of two blue armchairs in the residency today. Elizabeth bought a large suite of furniture from French craftsman Pierre Antoine Bellange. James added the American logos, and they are a big part of White House history.
Elizabeth was so private, though, that she demanded all her letters be burned before she died. And
That
I'm
is
mad.
that is such a shame. I'm mad too. I bet they were good. She is now laid to rest next to her husband at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia.
Up next, we have Louisa Adams, who was born in London, making her the first foreign born First Lady. Prior to her husband's presidency, Louisa showed both dignity and grace as diplomatic wife of the U.S., but this wasn't always easy.
During the time her husband John Quincy Adams served as the first U.S. minister in Russia, she suffered from poor health and faced some extreme winters. Mind you, John Quincy never consulted her before he accepted the position.
Figures. He was also a creepy looking thing, wasn't he?
Yep. Louisa gave birth to a daughter while living there, but unfortunately, the child died the following year. She also completed an incredibly dangerous journey spanning over 2 months across Europe during the Napoleonic Wars, while leaving her children behind in Massachusetts, exposing herself to risks such as highwaymen and bitter cold. So, Louisa had been through it prior to serving as First Lady.
Hey, you want to go take a horse carriage ride through Europe?
Not at that time, but I'd do it now.
You can understand why she preferred quiet evenings in the White House after all the hardships she had faced, but she's still remembered as a gracious hostess. Louisa was known to encourage dancing at the White House, but even then, her tenure was not happy. The marriage was apparently not a very warm relationship, so Louisa found loneliness in the White House. And she said, "This great unsocial house depresses me beyond expression. Sips for public sadness."
Yeah, that is really sad. Ugh. She remains the only First Lady to return to DC after her stint as First Lady because John Quincy served in the House of Representatives for 17 years until his death. She was also the first woman whose death was acknowledged by the federal government when Congress adjourned for mourning in 1852. Louisa and her husband are buried at the United First Parish Church in Quincy, Massachusetts, where John Quincy's parents are also buried.
Now we have quite the situation because the next First Lady unfortunately passes away prior to the presidential nomination. Yes, Rachel Jackson died before Andrew Jackson's inauguration, which is great since she would have rather be a pauper than live in that palace in Washington. Rachel's marriage to Andrew was not her first.
No, it wasn't her first. Her divorce to Louis Robards had not been finalized, so technically, Rachel had committed bigamy. She and Andrew were forced to remarry in 1794, and of course, political enemies love digging dirt on their opponents.
Quite the scandal back then. Wouldn't it be a good reality show? I'd eat some popcorn.
Absolutely. Andrew Jackson blamed his political enemies for her death. She is remembered as a caring and affectionate person. She and Andrew are laid in the garden of their home, the Hermitage. Due to the absence of a First Lady, Jackson's niece Emily Donaldson served as White House hostess. His daughter in law, Sarah York Jackson, also helped fill the role.
The early presidency definitely did not have a defined role for First Lady. Rather, it was most important for a wife or other close female resident to host the dinner party or reception at a moment's notice situation. 1833 happened to be the year when the White House received indoor plumbing.
Ooh, sips for that. Early American government still figuring things out, but at least they had a proper toilet.
So necessary.
Yeah, I could not
So
imagine
now,
going to the outhouse in the back. Nope.
so let's enter the decades leading up to the Civil War or the pre-Civil War era.
Yes, let's do that. The First Lady of this era had a similar situation to that of Thomas Jefferson's presidency, with Angelica Van Buren acting as hostess for widower President Martin Van Buren as Angelica was married to his son. He never even mentioned his wife Hannah in his autobiography.
And unfortunately for these three, they are barely rememberable, at least to me.
Ouch. Ouch. Yeah.
So next comes Anna Harrison, who technically became First Lady but never reached Washington because her husband died after 1 month in office.
Fun fact, her husband, William Henry Harrison, gave the longest inaugural speech in history, over 2 hours, in the wind and the rain with no hat or coat.
He's a smart one, ain't he?
Yeah. Next, we have Letitia Tyler. Following Mrs. Harrison, we have a sad situation with Letitia Tyler. Letitia's daughter in law, Priscilla, said she performed her First Lady tasks so promptly that you can't tell she does it. But unfortunately, she was the First Lady to die while in the White House. She did not expect her VP husband, John, to become president, but so it goes with life, and a bout of pneumonia for not being prepared for the elements. She was also the youngest First Lady to die at the age of 51. She was bound in an invalid's chair for around 4 years before her death after a series of strokes.
After Letitia's death, John Tyler remarries while still president to somebody 30 years younger named Julia Gardner. Julia had turned down John's advances after Letitia's death, but he clearly wore her down. They ended up having 7 children together, but John had already had 9 with Letitia. It's a crowded house, ain't it?
Wow. That should have been called a squeeze right there. Um, Julia, get this, Julia considered herself queen of the land. Like a queen, she wanted to greet guests while seated on a pedestal, flanked by her Vestal virgins, aka ladies in waiting. In addition, she was the driving force behind the White House's collection of First Lady portraits. Sips for historical preservation.
Amen. Julia unfortunately had to fight for her pension. It wasn't until 1881 that she started receiving $1,200 a year, about $40,000 in today's money. She is laid to rest in Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia, just like Elizabeth Monroe. Her husband is also buried there, along with John Monroe in President's Circle.
Next up is Sarah Polk, who was the Secretary Extraordinaire.
Just like me.
Indeed, extremely politically involved and advisor to President James Polk. Still photography developed around this time, so it changed presidential campaigns. Luckily, she looked serene in photos because she expected a $25,000 a year salary, not to include housekeeping or butter churning. That's roughly $1 million in today's money.
Yeah, okay, girl. Although she always gave her husband the credit for her political ideas, as any good wife of that era would, she too had an intellectual mind. She was able to converse with the politically elite as well as military leaders of the Confederacy and the Union.
In contrast to Louisa Adams, Sarah Polk famously banned dancing and alcohol at White House events due to her religious beliefs. She
Fun.
did allow wine at dinner. How generous of her, right? She and her husband are buried near the Tennessee Capitol. They had no children. James died 4 decades before Sarah. Like Queen Victoria, she wore black or mourning clothes for the rest of her life.
Now, for you ladies out there who enjoy hearing stories about strong women who know how to adapt, Margaret Taylor is your girl. Yes, she was very private and avoided public attention, but I don't blame her one bit. She's one of the least known of all the first ladies, and it's actually only in this century that photos were uncovered of her. Her youngest daughter, Betty, oversaw her official White House hostess responsibilities.
And prior to being First Lady, Margaret, aka Peggy, lived in remote outposts with her husband and said she was every bit of a soldier that Zachary Taylor was. And he actually agreed with her.
That's actually pretty impressive.
Can you imagine living in any army outpost with bed bugs and fleas, eating crackers?
Absolutely not.
Yep. Well, she did that. So sips up for being a trooper and standing by her man. I can't barely handle seeing a spider or killing a wasp, nor would we be able to keep our nails done in that sort of environment. So
Not
hard
so.
no. And side note, looking at Zachary Taylor's portrait right here, which if you're listening on YouTube, you'll see this in our slideshow video. He kind of looks like a cross between Kevin Costner and Charlton Heston, wouldn't you say?
Holy crap. Yeah, now I see it. Just put a cowboy hat on him and we're in Yellowstone.
Exactly. So check that out. FYI, also early in Zachary Taylor's presidency, he actually died from intestinal disease, likely caused by consuming hot milk at a July 4th parade. No sips for that. Yuck.
So enter Abigail Fillmore, wife of President Millard Fillmore, and the first lady to have a job outside of the home. She was a teacher, like my friend, who
Mhm.
created the first White House library, which is now the Yellow Oval Room. She, like Margaret Taylor, left the White House social activities to be hosted by her daughter, Mary Abigail.
Abigail, too, was unexpectedly thrown into the role after President Taylor unexpectedly died. Fun fact, she was able to persuade her husband to discontinue flogging in the U.S. Navy.
Serious consequences, huh?
Absolutely.
Then comes one of the most tragic first ladies, or just really wives in general. It took 2 years for Jane Pierce to fully fulfill her duties as First Lady, and she described the White House as morbid and sickly. And in pretty much every picture I found of her, she's wearing black.
The reason being, she lost all three of her children. The third child, son Benny, was killed by a train right in front of her. I can understand how needing to be in the limelight was probably the most absolute last thing Jane and her president husband Franklin could handle after experiencing such a horrible event. The history of our country has been paved with tears, to be sure. That just gives me chills. It's terrible.
Mhm. And then at the opposite end of the spectrum, we get James Buchanan, who's the only bachelor president. So his niece, Harriet Lane, acted as first hostess. Early on, Queen Victoria of England had been quite taken aback with Harriet when she was presented at court. So she had a bright public future ahead.
And she also became wildly popular with the American public, so much so that women copied her hairstyle and clothing. So she was a trendsetter. Harriet was always by her uncle's side and was known as the Democratic Queen. She also wanted better conditions for the Native Americans.
She is another of the three first ladies to have a ship named after her, the USS Harriet Lane, used and captured during the Civil War. Sips for the Coast Guard.
That's right. After President Buchanan leaves, now everything changes.
By the time Abraham Lincoln enters the White House, the country is on the brink of civil war, which means the next First Lady would face a level of public scrutiny and personal tragedy that no one before her had experienced.
Yes, I just ache for her. Bless her. Her life was full of unimaginable loss. Mary Todd Lincoln lost three children and eventually her husband. But she was more than the wife of the man assassinated at Ford's Theater.
She faced enormous criticism and struggled deeply with grief as well as financial troubles. She was a true shopaholic, obsessed with keeping up with the Joneses. Her own son had her committed later in life. But Liz, there's another detail about Mary Lincoln that most people don't realize.
Oh boy, I feel like I should brace myself.
Well, are you ready for some seances inside the White House?
Wait, actual seances?
Yep. During the Civil War, spiritualism became very popular in the US. People believed mediums could communicate with the dead, which honestly makes sense when you consider how much loss people were experiencing during the time.
Exactly. And Mary Lincoln was grieving deeply after the death of her son Willie in 1862. That was a loss that completely devastated her.
So, in her grief, she began attending seances hosted by mediums who claimed they could contact the spirits. There are accounts from visitors and White House staff who described evenings where the clairvoyant attempted to contact Willie's spirit.
Can you imagine the scene? The Civil War is raging outside, and inside the White House, people are sitting around a table trying to speak to the dead.
Sounds like something out of a Gothic novel or the precursor to that Ouija board.
Perhaps. Did Abraham Lincoln participate in these seances? Do you know?
Well, some accounts say he attended a few out of curiosity, though historians debate how seriously he took them.
Yeah, honestly, I picture him sitting there skeptical, smoking his pipe, and letting Mary have comfort that she clearly needed.
Most historians agree that Mary's involvement in spiritualism came from the overwhelming grief, rather than belief in the supernatural, which is kind of heartbreaking when you think about it.
It reminds us that even inside the White House, these were still parents grieving their child. History often remembers presidents as political figures, but moments like this remind us that they were also families trying to survive unimaginable loss.
Yep. So then we get to the end of the Civil War, and that ushered in the newly minted United States into the era of reform movements from Reconstruction through the suffrage era. Andrew Johnson was Lincoln's vice president, so the Johnsons take office at the end of the Civil War. Eliza Johnson was ill with tuberculosis when her husband Andrew was sworn in following Abe's assassination. Her daughters helped to run the White House. She did, however, still advise and support her husband while in office, but was so afraid for their safety after the Lincoln assassination. She said, "I do not like this public life at all." And I can't blame her.
Yeah, who could blame her? I'd be constantly looking over my shoulder. And I mean, tuberculosis seemed to be somewhat of a common disease back then. It was also called consumption, and people would cough up blood. It was almost like their lungs were just disintegrating. If anybody's ever had the TB test to see if you've ever been exposed, that's the little needle they put in your arm and it creates a little bubble.
I worked in a hospital too, so I had to get it. And I was like, "Oh my god, why do we have to do this? Do I have it? What is going on?"
Pretty sure, and I'll confirm this in research. I'm pretty sure that there's actually now, an antibiotic for it,
Mm,
if you would catch it, but I never hear of anybody getting it, so.
no, but it's on trend for old diseases to be coming back. I mean, we got Ebola going on right now in Africa.
And measles.
Oh, yeah, I
Yeah,
got that.
that's coming back, so, yeah, stay aware. Now next, conversely, the wife of Ulysses S. Grant, the commanding general of the U.S. Army. Julia Grant was good at being a military wife, but she absolutely loved being first lady. She wanted to project her family as the ideal American family. She wanted the White House to serve as a model for the country, both inside and out. She thought it belonged to the nation, not just the people in power.
Fun fact, she was the first lady to write a memoir, although it wasn't released until 1975. Ulysses had some money troubles later in life and was paid good money to write his memoirs, which turned into 2 volumes, both
Wow.
of which are really good reads.
Julia hosted the first ever state dinner for a reigning monarch, which happened to honor King Kalakaua of the Kingdom of Hawaii. I remember hearing this last summer when visiting the Iolani Palace in Honolulu. Mrs. Grant put on a lavish 30-course dinner for the sovereign and decorated the White House with beautiful flowers. In turn, the Hawaiians were able to obtain a tax free status on sugar as the previous tariffs were financially burdening them.
Amen for financial freedom.
Absolutely.
And then we get to the depressing Lucy Hayes, who became known as Lemonade Lucy because she banned all alcohol from the White House. She and her husband Rutherford thought that, and I quote, "Alcohol leads to prostitution, it leads to bankruptcy, and it leads to venereal disease. Take a sip of temperance punch for that sage advice."
The temperance movement was gaining serious momentum. She was the first lady with a college education and thought a woman's mind is as strong as man's, equal in all things and superior in some.
That's right, girl. But Congress wouldn't approve funds for Lucy to update the White House. So she moved furniture around to cover the holes in the floor and reversed curtains to hide the frayed edges. Cheers to the original Martha Stewart. She also added a huge conservatory to the White House.
She did her best with what she had. Now we have Lucretia Garfield. So brace yourself for another sad story. Lucretia Garfield, aka Crete, was another intellectual woman that advised her husband James while managing a household. They had a total of 7 children, although only 5 lived into adulthood, but still a very large family, especially by today's standards.
Hmm.
Yet she still helped her husband with writing speeches and appointing cabinet members. So she seemed to have no problem assuming the role of First Lady as she took on official duties and attended all events.
And she brought back alcohol. Praise Jesus.
Yay!
Sips to the new Garfield era parties. She contracted malaria and needed to travel to the seaside to recover. But while waiting for that train, the president was shot. James ends up dying at the Jersey Shore a couple of months later.
Oddly enough, Crete had met the assassin, Charles Guiteau, in one of her weekly receptions for people to present their issues to the president. Guiteau thought he deserved a job for helping James get elected. This First Lady outlived her husband by 37 years, and they are both laid to rest at the James A. Garfield Memorial in Cleveland, Ohio.
Following Crete, we have another extenuating circumstance with Ellen Lewis being married to Chester Alan Arthur, who became POTUS after Garfield's death. But she died of pneumonia before Chester became the commander in chief. But her husband never stopped mourning.
He cared for her memory so well that he wouldn't give anyone the place of First Lady, only asking his sister Molly to step in at times and care for his daughter. The window that he had installed for her in St. John's Church could be seen at night from the White House. Sigh. Sips
Sigh.
for love's lost.
hmm Now, Liz, it's time to talk about one of my favorites, if not one of the most influential First Lady stories ever.
Ooh, I can't wait. Let me guess. It's weird for at least today's standards.
Very.
Okay, I'm ready.
Frances Cleveland became the First Lady at just 21 years of age. She married Grover Cleveland in the Blue Room of the White House. But here's the part that's kind of ick. Grover Cleveland had known Frances since she was a child because he was a business partner of her father's. After her father died, Grover basically became Frances's ward, making all the important decisions like Frances's education.
But at the time, the wedding caused a huge national sensation. Frances Cleveland quickly became one of the most popular first ladies ever, largely in part because of her fashion choices. She had a 15-foot wedding train, so another influencer of the time.
Maybe Princess Di got some inspiration from that dress?
Perhaps. Followed by paparazzi everywhere, women wanted to look like and dress like her, and businesses wanted to use her name, image, and likeness, even without her permission. Only 31 people attended the ceremony, and no cameras were allowed at the wedding, and the only visual documentation is a painting.
Fun fact, when I visited George W. Bush's library in Dallas, I bought one of those 3D golden Christmas ornaments depicting the nuptials with the only visual evidence that's, from the wedding, and it's one of my favorite ornaments. Anyways, sometimes history is complicated, and I'll sip to that.
But wait, there's more. This wasn't the first time Grover had been center stage next to a woman.
Oh, yeah, the love child scandal. Cleveland admitted that he may have fathered a child with a woman named Maria Halpin in 1874, years before the marriage. The child, Oscar Folsom Cleveland, became James E. King Jr. when he was adopted by one of the physicians who treated Maria Halpin in an asylum. Unfortunately, his political opponents turned it into a campaign chant.
Ma, where's my pa?
Ma, where's my
Where's my
pa?
pa?
And when Cleveland won the election, his supporters answered,
Gone
"Gone
to
to the
the
White
White
House.
House.
Ha
Ha,
ha
ha,
ha."
ha. Grover had 5 children with Frances. Esther was the first child of a sitting president to be born in the White House. Their eldest, Ruth, died at the age of 12 after a Chicago candy maker was sued for using Babe Ruth's name without permission. The man changed the name of the candy bar to Baby Ruth after Ruth Cleveland.
Do you know I don't think I've ever had one?
I think I've had one once. It's not my favorite. Sorry
Uh,
for the Baby Ruth lovers out there.
Francis was also instrumental in keeping up appearances while Grover underwent secret surgery on a yacht to remove teeth and parts of his palate after getting cancer. They used anesthetic and some topical cocaine, sips to 19th century medicine.
Yeah, I'm sure that wasn't a completely sterile environment, right? Most notably, Grover Cleveland is also the first president to serve non consecutive terms. Upon leaving the White House in 1889, Francis told staffers, quote, I want you to take good care of the White House, for I want to find everything just as it is now when we come back 4 years from today.
And luckily, that quote aged well because the Clevelands did re enter the mansion in 1893. Politics has always been a little ruthless. You know, our school history books really left out those juicy details that we love so much, which is a huge bummer. Frances later worked in copyright legislation and is the first lady to remarry. However, she is buried next to Grover in Princeton, New Jersey.
Being a teacher, if I had to teach some of these details, you'd never get through a lesson. So I can see why. I see why it's left out. All right, let's now shed some light on Caroline Harrison. You'll understand why I say that in a minute. Caroline died of tuberculosis in 1892 and was the second First Lady to die while serving the role. She had also been a teacher as well as an artist. It also must be noted that she was the First Lady to have a Christmas tree in the White House because Christmas trees are my favorite. Sips to Yuletide.
She started the White House China Collection. In addition, she founded the Johns Hopkins Medical School and was the first President General of the Daughters of the American Revolution. So Caroline made quite the effort in her 3.5 years.
She was the First Lady to have, get this, electricity in the White House. People could actually see the china without holding a candle. But this lady laid a nugget that still rings true 150 years later. I am disgusted with newspapers and reporters. Truth is a characteristic entirely unknown to them. If she said that in the 1800s, imagine what she would think of the press today.
Fake news. Another handkerchief might be needed for Ida McKinley's story. President William McKinley's wife struggled with epilepsy, and her husband was extremely protective of her, watching for signs of a seizure. She still received guests, though, while sitting in a blue velvet chair holding a fragrant bouquet to silently advise against shaking hands.
Oh, that's really beautiful. She couldn't wait to get out of the White House. She said, when his term expires, he will come home and we will settle down quietly and he will belong to me. Sadly, that never happened for William because he was assassinated in 1901 at the Pan American Exposition in New York. Her husband even spoke of his concern for her as he was dying.
It is said that she visited his grave almost daily and now lies beside him and their two small daughters in Canton, Ohio's McKinley Memorial Mausoleum.
Seriously, some of these stories give me chills while we read them. It's interesting. Since McKinley is assassinated, the VP Teddy Roosevelt takes over. So his wife Edith becomes the next First Lady. Edith Roosevelt professionalized the White House staff and organized the modern household structure to include the first White House social secretary.
Edith also had a hand in the 1902 White House renovation. Congress appropriated $470,000 for her efforts. Only 18 mil in today's money.
That's nothing.
She wanted the home to reflect the nation's history as well as have a more secluded residential living space. The conservatory that Miss Hayes had built was demolished in order to make way for the new West Wing. So sips for Rob Lowe's role as a communications director on the nominal TV show. Yum yum.
Oh, yes, he did amazing in that role as well. Now we have Edith Roosevelt passing the torch on to Helen Taft, who suffered from a stroke just 2 months into her time in the White House. But she was a great advisor for her husband on people he appointed. She even frequented Congress and the Supreme Court.
She helped bring the famous cherry blossom trees to D.C. and started the beginning of the First Lady gown collection by donating her inaugural gown to the Smithsonian. She's buried next to her husband and is one of only two First Ladies buried in Arlington National Cemetery.
Correct. The other First Lady buried there would be Jacqueline Kennedy, one of my personal favorite First Ladies.
Now, one of my favorite tidbits is that Helen's husband, William, was the heaviest president to date and needed a specially made bathtub big enough to hold him.
Wow. All right, now we have the last administration we will mention in this episode, and it is that of the Wilsons. Ellen Wilson focused her attentions on the White House gardens and what was to eventually be the modern Rose Garden. She even planned 2 weddings at the White House for her and President Woodrow Wilson's daughters, Jessie and Eleanor. She advocated for housing reform in Washington after visiting the alleyways of the Capitol and finding unsanitary and unaffordable accommodations. Congress passed the Alley Bill in 1914, the same year she unfortunately died from kidney disease.
But here's where things get interesting. Woodrow remarries to Edith Bowling in 1915, and she closely advised her husband, even accompanying him to Europe during negotiations for the Treaty of Versailles. Yes, this is the First Lady who saw us through the First World War.
Then Woodrow suffers from a stroke in 1919 while traveling back to Washington from a speaking tour. This stroke left him partially paralyzed, and the situation was actually kept a secret from the public.
Which is hard to do. Edith essentially controlled access to the president in order to keep his condition private. She reviewed documents, decided what her husband needed to see, and she communicated his decisions.
Some historians even call her the first female president in practice. She lived until 1961 at age 89 and is interred at Washington National Cathedral.
And during Edith Wilson's time as First Lady, a monumental change happens. In 1920, the 19th Amendment is ratified.
That's right. Women across the United States finally gain the right to vote, which means future first ladies will live in a very different political world.
I bet they do. Now, for some love letters to our favorites who shaped this era. Martha Washington, thank you for starting it all, literally from nothing.
Absolutely. And now, Dolly Madison, thank you for saving that painting of George Washington.
Thank you, Mary Todd Lincoln, for bringing some mysticism into the White House with your seances and a trip to the asylum after so much tragedy already. You're a true survivor.
Thank you, Frances Cleveland, for showing future women the right way to behave in front of cameras in the midst of scandal.
And then Edith Wilson, thank you for using your voice and advising your husband in a patriarchal world and preserving secrecy. These women lived in a world where they had no political authority, but they still helped shape the presidency and influenced American history from the White House drawing room parlors.
Now, time for our pop culture corner. If you want more information, here are some sources that we like. There's some books, First Ladies by Susan Swain. And then there's some fictional portrayals, such as George Washington II, The Forging of a Nation. This was from 1984 with Patty Duke as Martha. Then
And
there's
then,
Abigail Adams, played by Laura Linney, in the HBO miniseries John Adams, and also Martha Jefferson Randolph, played by Gwyneth Paltrow in Jefferson in Paris,
and then there's
1995.
Dolly Madison, portrayed by Ginger Rogers in Magnificent Doll in 1946. And then finally, in my eyes, Sally Field's portrayal of Mary Todd Lincoln in the movie Lincoln from 2012 with Daniel Day-Lewis was so poignant and probably the most interesting thing about the movie.
I would agree. So we're wrapping things up now. Our next episode will take you to the modern First Lady era, where they started stepping out of that drawing room and onto the world stage. Think Eleanor Roosevelt, World War II, and women stepping into global political influence.
And then eventually comes Watergate, which means things really got chaotic.
Thanks for listening to Love Letters to History, where history is the past and the past is our present to you.
Same time.
Same sip.
Cheers!
This has been Love Letters to History with Emily and Liz. Have a question, a favorite historical figure, or an episode idea? We'd love to hear from you. Email us at loveletterstohistory@yahoo.com. Also, follow us on social media for behind-the-scenes stories and upcoming episodes. Until next time, history is the past, and the past is our present to you. Cheers!
We draw the lines of history, scenes to the stories that last forever. Love letters to history. We remember eternally.